This one from 1886, Chinese Exclusion Act cartoon, from the George D. Magic Washing Machine Company. So there was a washing machine company called George D. Magic, and basically the this washing machine company released this political cartoon saying that your clothes will get as clean as the U.S. is being cleansed of Chinese immigrants, coinciding with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it basically was intended to promote the company's new washing machine materials. So you have, for those of you listening, again, another Chinese person with the long hair being kicked out, having the same kind of reptilian or animal-looking face and hands, being kicked out by Uncle Sam, who's holding a proclamation. And you see other Chinese folks in the bottom left corner who seem to be heading toward the Pacific Ocean, back to China.
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
A lot of times people act as if China has been a superpower on an equal footing as the US forever. And people forget that during the 1800s, what they call the century of humiliation, China was subjected to the 2 opium wars by the Western imperialist powers. They were forced to consume drugs. They were colonized. They were completely exploited and marginalized by the imperialist system. And in many ways, it continues today. And I think it's important to give that context, because also a lot of the fears of, especially from the white Western imperialist countries, of a strong and united China, those have been taking place since the 1800s. And what I want to do is I want to share a few images really depicting that and bringing that home, because this fear of China, this brainwashing and propaganda from the West that China is this evil empire that's going to take over, and they're animals and they're a hive mind. That's sort of the stereotype, right? That they can't think for themselves. They're just like ants that are becoming this huge empire. That idiocy has been prevalent since the 1800s. And so there's this first cartoon that I want to share. This is a cartoon from 1869 called Pacific Chivalry. Encouragement to Chinese immigration. So basically, at this time, this is a cartoon by Thomas Nast depicting the way that white people in the U.S. viewed Chinese immigrants in the 1800s. Mind you, this is after the 2 opium wars. This is at the height of the crisis in China, when China was completely obliterated by imperialism, and Chinese people were forced to move to where I'm speaking to you from now, which is quote unquote California. And so a lot of Chinese workers were forced to move to California, work on the railroads, because you had westward expansion, you have the gold rush. And so at this cartoon, 1869, it basically depicts the racism of white people against Chinese migrants. But keep in mind that this was not from a point of view of like trying to expose the racism. It was encouraging it, basically. Look, even in the bottom, encouragement to Chinese immigration. So this is the message that a lot of the white settlers in California had of Chinese migrants who were just trying to survive and get by. So that's one image. And another image that I want to share is this one, which is 1881. This one is called The Coming Man, a cartoon from 1881, published in the San Francisco Wasp, a newspaper, approximately 1 year before the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it depicts, for those of you who are listening, a Chinese man depicted in the traditional garb, which was popular at the time, the long ponytail with the hat. And on his hand, it says Monopoly, and his hand looks like sort of reptilian in a way. He's depicted in a very childlike and demeaning manner, but he's still this kind of like evil, demonic force. And Dr. Jarabald asked, did he say the San Francisco Wasp? Yeah, it was literally called the San Francisco Wasp. So they weren't even holding back. They were straight up about it. They were like, yo, we are the WASPs and we hate China. And so this is a cartoon. Like, this is really the coming man. And so, mind you, right, this image basically appealed to the U.S. fears of a Chinese, quote, takeover of American society and enterprise. Even though the Chinese only occupied less than 1% of the population, they continue to reinforce this idea that China was going to sort of take over and become the new dominant power. And it's something that is really disgusting to see, because it's something that continues today, where they're showing his hand with monopoly. They're saying China's going to take over the rising dragon, the rising empire. That's one of the images as well that tends to be popularized, the dragon. So that's from 1881, right? And so basically, the following years, you had what was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically excluded Chinese immigrants from being able to move to the U.S. and work. It was the first and only in the U.S. overtly racist and discriminatory act against immigrants from a specific country. And you had this sorry, that's for later on. You had this one from 1886, Chinese Exclusion Act cartoon from the George D. Magic Washing Machine Company. So there was a washing machine company called George D. Magic, and basically this washing machine company released this political cartoon saying that your clothes will get as clean as the U.S. is being cleansed of Chinese immigrants, coinciding with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it basically was intended to promote the company's new washing machine materials. So you have, for those of you listening, again, another Chinese person with the long hair being kicked out, having the same kind of reptilian or animal-looking face and hands, being kicked out by Uncle Sam, who's holding a proclamation. And you see other Chinese folks in the bottom left corner who seem to be heading toward the Pacific Ocean, back to China. Again, most of this is happening where I'm speaking to you from now, California, aka Chumash land, settled Chumash land, indigenous land. And so this is where the oldest Chinese community actually existed in the U.S. And this is the stuff that was going on here. So this stuff about, China taking over and being evil, and they're these collectivist hive mind creatures, this goes back to the 1800s. This is not new. So I was wondering, Helen, if you have any thoughts about that, and maybe if you want to talk about that, how that makes you feel,
I have a really good book to recommend to everybody. It's actually from an American scholar, Jonathan Spence. He's a Yale sinologist. He's passed away now, and has a great bibliography. But this one that I particularly want to recommend people is called The Chan, or the Khan, I guess. But The Chan of the Great Continent, China in the Western Mind. He traces this writing about Chinese people from the Western perspective all the way to the Venetians, all the way to the Portuguese from about 1400s, where you started to have a lot of people who, because of the Mongol situation, that going to China was easier for the Europeans. Yes, exactly, that book. There were a lot of travelers who did not actually make it all the way into China. At most, they might have gone close to what is modern day between Inner Mongolia and Beijing. And there's a few things. One is sometimes they would literally make shit up because, so-and-so is paid by the Jesuit order to write a certain report, but he didn't actually get into the country. So what he would do is look at what other people have written before, and based on what he has seen as what he thinks is Chinese, come up with a travelogue story. And this went on for hundreds of years. And it got worse and worse and worse, of Europeans talking about China from, it's essentially not China. It's essentially like their idea of China. It's like basically they're talking to themselves. It's like I don't really know China, but I think China is like this. And then I'm going to say it's bad because I am the guy who wrote Robinson Crusoe, for example, was a very very, actually, he said, I wrote that book specifically because of my hatred of China, because I wanted to go away by myself. This idea of sort of, it's a twisted thing. It's like, in a way, you can see that in this case, the white superiority or the European superiority, or the even, is actually a European inferiority, because it's a compensation. It's an overcompensation for not actually being able to make a Chinese friend, because there were other Europeans who did make it. There was a very famous Italian called Matteo Rizzi. He was one of the first, he was the one who actually translated the Bible into Chinese. But if you actually look at his bibliography and his life, the Bible was one of it was like a minor work for him. He actually, his major work was he spent about 40 years with the Ming emperor and some of the court literatis, and he translated a lot of Chinese classics into Italian. He was the first to start this kind of stuff. So yeah, there were successes, but people like that did not write about China in, it's sort of the Jonathan Spence, people should go read that book more than just I can explain. It's a very, very good book. But yes, this is, it from the 15th century, 16th century, it gets more and more comprehensive in this sort of fictionalization of China. By the time you get to the Fu Manchu series, by the time you get to Pearl Buck, who was one of the best-selling novelists in America in the 19th century or the 20th century, it gets to... It's even hard to talk about this sometimes. When I think about it, it's just so incredible that could be the case, because this actually goes with something that is happening currently, because I've heard people online say, why should we not like China? I bet they don't like us in China. But this is the point. I grew up in China. Chinese people do not make TV shows to make fun of anybody.
Right.
This is a very specifically thing we don't like. We could make, there's Chinese TV shows about Africans, about Europeans, about even the Korean War. I watched the Battle of Changjing Lake about the Korean War. They used all American actors and great CGI. It was good. But like basically that's not true. China does not like anybody. And in particular, a giant country that we trade all the time, that we have people going back and forth for thousands of years. Why? Why would you hate people? Why would you create that context for yourself? That's how I feel, I guess. But
yeah,
it's easier to make rumors than to how you say, to dispel it. But ultimately, I think all this is a way to distract people here. They, in a way, know that they cannot really hurt China, but they can divide and conquer people here. Like there's a saying we say in Chinese, 鹬蚌相争，渔翁得利. If the crane and the shellfish fight each other, the fisherman is going to win.